The oldest empire in the world is burning in silence. A dead pharaoh lies abandoned in his desecrated tomb while the streets of Thebes fill with smoke and screams of panic. Priests flee with whatever they can carry, foreign soldiers loot ancient temples, and in the middle of the chaos one question echoes like an impossible nightmare: how did the civilization that built the pyramids end up here? But wait, before we continue, if you love history as much as I do, subscribe now and hit the bell. We make these documentaries with real research, and your support makes it possible for us to keep bringing you fascinating stories like this, because what you are about to discover is not the simple story of an empire that fell overnight. It is the complex chronicle of a system that seemed eternal, unbreakable, and divine for 3,000 years. An order where pharaohs were living gods, where the Nile dictated life and death, where stones seemed to defy time itself. And yet, that colossus also had cracks, fissures that opened slowly, almost invisible at first, until they became abysses that swallowed entire dynasties. Was it foreign invaders who destroyed Egypt? Or was the giant already collapsing from within, eaten away by power struggles, economic crisis, and the exhaustion of a model that had worked for millennia? The answer is not simple. It never is when an entire world disappears. Come with me as we journey through the last centuries of ancient Egypt, that we will see how the pharaohs lost their absolute power to ambitious priests. We will meet the sea peoples, that devastating wave that erased entire civilizations from the map. We will walk among the desecrated tombs of the Valley of the Kings, where even the mummies were torn from their eternal rest. And we will face the question that still divides historians: can we really speak of a fall, or was it more of a slow transformation into something else? Because in the end, what fell in Egypt was not only a dynasty. It was a way of understanding the cosmos, divinity, and time. It was the end of an era when men believed they could touch eternity. And that ending began much earlier than you imagined. It was the year 1550 BCE when the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty expelled the Hyksos, those Asian invaders who had ruled Lower Egypt for more than a century. The victory was not only military, it was symbolic, spiritual, and cosmic. Egypt was reborn under the sign of Ammonius Ra, the supreme god of Thebes, and its pharaohs launched themselves into a new imperial age that would stretch from Nubia in the deep south to the lands of Syria and the Euphrates in the north. This was the new kingdom, the Golden Age. Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt, led 17 military campaigns that secured tribute in gold, slaves, and raw materials. Amenhotep III transformed Thebes into the most magnificent city in the known world. Its temples rivaled mountains, and its statues seemed to challenge the sky itself. The power of the pharaoh appeared absolute, unquestioned, and eternal. But inside that splendor, a tension was growing that few people noticed at the time. The temples of Ammonius were accumulating enormous wealth. Their priests controlled land, cattle, mines, and workshops. At one point, the high priest of Ammonius came to command more resources than the pharaoh himself imagined. That for a moment, a religious official with more economic power than the living god of Egypt. Then came one of the most mysterious pharaohs in history, Akhenaten. He ascended the throne as Amenhotep IV, but soon rejected Ammonius and all the traditional gods. He declared that only one god existed, Aten, the sun disk. He closed ancient temples, persecuted the priests of Ammonius, erased the god's name from monuments, and founded a new capital in the middle of the desert. Akhetaten, the city of the horizon of Aten. There, surrounded by his wife Nefertiti and their daughters, he tried to create a new Egypt based on a revolutionary faith. But Egypt was not prepared for such a rupture. The people saw Ammonius and the old gods as the source of their prosperity. The strict priests plotted in the shadows. The army, deprived of campaigns and plunder, lost morale. And on the borders of the empire, vassals took advantage of the internal confusion to rebel. The famous Amarna letters, clay tablets sent by allied princes, repeatedly begged for military help that never came. Akhenaten was too absorbed in his one god to attend to the affairs of the world. When he died, his religious revolution died with him. His successor, the young Tutankhamun, restored the cult of Ammonius, returned power to the priests, and moved the capital back to Thebes. Akhetaten was abandoned, its temples dismantled, and Akhenaten's name erased from official history. But the damage had already been done. The prestige of the pharaoh had been wounded. The idea that a ruler could make a mistake, that the gods could be challenged, had taken root in many minds. After Tutankhamun died without an heir, the throne passed into the hands of generals. Horemheb, a former military commander, proclaimed himself pharaoh and restored order with an iron hand. Then came Ramesses I, founder of the 19th dynasty, followed by his son Seti I, who reconquered lost territories. And finally the most famous of them all, Ramesses II. Ramesses II ruled for 66 years. He built more temples and statues than any other pharaoh. He fought the Hittites in the famous Battle of Kadesh, which, although indecisive, was presented as a glorious victory on monuments throughout Egypt. He signed the first known peace treaty in history. He had more than 100 children, and when he died at the age of 90, he left behind an Egypt that seemed prosperous and powerful. But appearances can be deceiving. During his long reign, Ramesses II exhausted the country's resources on megalomaniac construction projects. His successors inherited an empty treasury and an overburdened administrative system. The temples kept growing richer while the state grew poorer, and on the horizon a new threat was beginning to take shape. They were called the Sea Peoples. Around 1200 BCE, a wave of violent migrations shook the entire eastern Mediterranean. No one knows for certain where they came from or why they moved. Perhaps droughts, perhaps earthquakes, perhaps the collapse of their own societies. What is clear is that they destroyed everything in their path. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's rival for centuries, disappeared completely. The city-states of the Syrian coast were reduced to ashes. Cyprus, Crete, and Greece all suffered devastation, and then they turned their eyes toward Egypt. Ramesses III, pharaoh of the 20th dynasty, faced not one but several waves of invaders. In the 8th year of his reign, he repelled a massive attack by land and by sea. His reliefs at Medinet Habu show epic naval battles, with Egyptian ships ramming enemy vessels, archers firing from the decks, and bodies falling into the water. It was a victory, yes. Egypt survived when other empires fell. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The army was exhausted, the treasury was drained, and worst of all, Ramesses III had to settle thousands of prisoners of war as mercenaries inside Egypt itself, Libyans, Nubians, and Sea Peoples. They were all integrated into the Egyptian military, weakening its traditional identity. In just a few decades, foreign commanders began to accumulate power, land, and titles. The army was no longer fully Egyptian, then something unthinkable happened. In the 29th year of his reign, Ramesses III became the victim of a conspiracy inside his own palace. His secondary wife, Tai, tried to place her son on the throne through a plot that involved high officials, guards, and even magicians who supposedly used wax spells to weaken the pharaoh. The coup failed. The conspirators were executed, but Ramesses III died shortly afterward, possibly from the wounds he received during the assassination attempt. A pharaoh murdered by his own family. The sacred inviolability of the throne had been destroyed. After his death, Egypt entered an unstoppable decline. His successors, all named Ramesses from the 4th to the 11th, were increasingly weak figures. Royal power was fragmented between the high priests of Ammonius in Thebes and the generals in the north. The country began to divide once again, as it had in the dark periods between the Old and Middle Kingdoms. And here we reach one of the darkest and least known episodes in Egyptian history, the looting of royal tombs. For centuries, the pharaohs had been buried in the Valley of the Kings, surrounded by unimaginable treasures meant to accompany them into eternity, gold, jewelry, furniture, statues, all protected by magical seals, curses, and the watchful eyes of official guardians. But in the final years of the 20th dynasty, when administrative chaos and corruption took over the country, those guardians became thieves. Judicial papyri from the period record brutal interrogations of captured looters. One of them confessed, "We opened the coffins, found the noble mummy of the king, found gold in abundance, took everything we found, and set the rest on fire. The mummies of the most powerful pharaohs in history were stripped, desecrated, and some were even burned so the gold could be melted out of their wrappings. Imagine the scene: corrupt officials, desperate priests, and common thieves entering sacred tombs, tearing amulets from the chests of pharaohs, smashing sarcophagi, separating heads from bodies in search of necklaces. It was not just a crime. It was a cosmic sacrilege. If the pharaohs could not reach eternal life, then what was the meaning of the world's order? Horrified loyal priests took desperate measures. They gathered the mummies they could save and hid them in two secret caches, one in Deir el-Bahri and another in the tomb of Amenhotep II. There they remained hidden for almost 3,000 years until modern archaeologists rediscovered them in the 19th century. While the tombs were being looted, political power completely disintegrated. By around 1070 BCE, the high priest of Ammonius in Thebes, Herihor, proclaimed himself pharaoh of Upper Egypt. At the same time, in the north, the dynasty of Tanis controlled Lower Egypt. Egypt, the land that for 3,000 years had symbolized divine unity, was now divided in two. This was the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, an age of fragmentation that would last for more than 4 centuries. During that time, Egypt was ruled by rival dynasties, many of them of foreign origin. First came the Libyans, warriors settled in the delta after the invasions of the Sea Peoples. One of their leaders, Shoshenkai, founded the 22nd dynasty and is even mentioned in the Bible as the pharaoh who plundered the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. But the arrival of the Libyans did not stop the country's disintegration. Soon there were 2, then 3, then 5 dynasties ruling different parts of Egypt at the same time. In the south, the Nubian kings of Kush began expanding northward, carrying the banner of Ammonius. Around 730 BCE, an extraordinary conqueror emerged from the south. His name was Pi. Pi, king of Nubia, considered himself the true heir of the ancient pharaohs. He worshipped Ammonius with devotion, studied sacred texts, and was horrified by the state of decay in which Egypt had fallen that he decided it was his duty to restore religious purity and national unity. With a disciplined army, he marched north. What followed was a brilliant military campaign. City after city fell before Pi. When local princes surrendered, he forgave them if they showed piety toward the gods. When they resisted, their cities were destroyed. Finally, in Memphis, the ancient capital, Pi was crowned pharaoh of all Egypt. The 25th dynasty, known as the Nubian or Kushite dynasty, had begun. For almost a century, the Nubian pharaohs tried to revive the greatness of the past. They built temples, restored monuments, and imitated the art of the ancient empire. But the world had changed, and from the east a new power was rising like an unavoidable storm, Assyria. The Assyrians were masters of war in the Middle East. Their armies used iron, heavy cavalry, and devastating siege tactics. They had conquered Babylon, destroyed the kingdom of Israel, and now they set their sights on Egypt, the last great prize. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. Pharaoh Taharka tried to resist but was defeated. The Assyrians took Memphis and looted its temples. Taharka fled south. It seemed like the end, but the Egyptians did not give up. Taharka reorganized his forces and briefly recovered control. His nephew Tanudaman continued the resistance. Still, the Assyrians returned with renewed fury. In 664 BCE, King Ashurbanipal launched a campaign of terror. His troops marched all the way to Thebes, the sacred city that had been untouchable for 100 years, and they destroyed it. The sack of Thebes was a trauma from which Egypt never fully recovered. The temples of Karnak and Luxor were profaned. Statues were toppled. Gold and silver were stolen. Assyrian chronicles boast of taking endless booty back to Nineveh. And most symbolic of all, the columns of smoke rising over Thebes announced that no place in Egypt was sacred anymore, that no god could protect them from foreign domination. That if you want, I can now turn this into